feel like kind of a fraud here. I'm actually not a professor. I perform the duties of a college professor, but you can't call me professor technically because I was getting a PhD in the 1990s and I didn't finish it. I got a job. The guy running the program said, I got you this job. You need to go get the job. Just go do it. I said, well, what about the degree? I didn't finish. He said, we'll worry about that later. And then he ended up becoming president of a college, and he hired me to teach without a PhD, which I don't know if any of you are in academia or considering academia. Nothing drives other academics crazier than the notion that they had to go through this hell, and this clown over here didn't even finish, and he gets to do the work. Like, it really pisses people off. That's not my fault. I think that's their fault, but that's the situation I'm in. The other thing, too, I will say about my fraudulent status is I'm supposed to be a foreign policy expert. I'm not really. What happened was I was working in government a long time ago for Rudy Giuliani, who you may have heard of lately because he's gotten embroiled in various Trump legal business, but was a highly successful mayor of New York City in the 1990s, who cleaned up New York City. Those of you who live here in Budapest, you don't probably have to deal, at least I never see it, this is my 5th trip in 2 years, you don't have to deal with a lot of crime, mayhem, disorder, homeless people sleeping on benches, open-air drug use, and that kind of thing. We used to have to deal with that a lot in American cities, and we do again, but there was a period of 20 or 30 years where American cities got very clean and orderly, and Rudy was a leader of that movement. From there, I went to Washington, D.C., and I kind of fell into foreign policy by happenstance. I won't tell the story now, but I ended up at the White House National Security Council for 4 years, and they were 4 very eventful years. This was 9/11, the beginning of the Afghanistan War, the beginning of the Iraq War, so 2001 to 2005. Because of that experience, I ended up going back into the White House with Donald Trump in 2017, and left in 2018. And since then, because I was sort of a defender, explainer of Trump's foreign policy, people ask me, well, why don't you come and talk about this, that, or the other thing? But I'm not a professor of international relations. My academic training was in political philosophy. That's what I like to do. That's what I like to write about. I actually don't even write about foreign policy that much. I do it occasionally when somebody asks or I have something to say. But, I'm glib enough that if I need to talk about it, I can talk about it. So what's going on in the United States right now in terms of our foreign policy approach? I think the first thing you have to understand, there's a basic uniparty agreement. The uniparty is a term used by people who don't like the American political system. Formally, we have 2 political parties. I'm sure you all know this, the Democrats and the Republicans. They're supposed to be opposed to one another, and in certain ways they are. But when it comes to the major currents of American foreign policy, they agree on everything, for the most part, and there's no real opposition. So I'll give you one example because it's recent and it's fresh, right? There are a lot of Republicans, that is to say rank and file Republicans, who don't like American support for Ukraine war. That's not to say they're against the Ukrainian people, although they're accused of that, I think unfairly. That's not to say that they're pro-Putin, although they're accused of that, also unfairly. It is to say that they just don't like the fact that the United States is spending billions of dollars on a foreign conflict that they don't necessarily think is winnable when the United States has so much to worry about at home, okay? Well, another aid package was up for a vote in the U.S. Congress several weeks ago, and it looked like the Republicans, who control the House of Representatives, but they don't control the Senate, and obviously they don't control the White House, they were going to defeat it. And somehow, this is still sort of murky how it happened, but I don't know how closely you follow our politics. I wouldn't if I were you. It's depressing for me as a citizen. Actually, it might be more fun for you because you can just look at it from the outside and see the comedy in it. It's harder for me to do that. Anyway, we kicked out a Speaker of the House. The Republicans kicked out their own guy last year, Kevin McCarthy, and they replaced him with Mike Johnson of Louisiana. And it looked like Johnson was going to go along with, he wasn't going to pass this aid bill that the White House desperately wanted and that all the Senate Republicans wanted. And all of a sudden, he had a couple of meetings, and Johnson came out and said, I support it. People were aghast. Like, how could this happen? That's what I mean by the uniparty, right? Even when some Republican or the Republicans, it seems, begin from a position of opposition or a different perspective, it always ends up in the same place, whatever that policy is. Whatever, the ruling uniparty, or to use a term that you hear a lot in American politics, the deep state wants, it seems to get, okay? Now, I'll caveat that a little by saying that, yes, while I think there is a uniparty, that's much truer at the leadership level than at the rank and file level. On the Democratic side, they're almost totally aligned. That is to say, the Democratic leadership, from the president, senior staff, cabinet members, Senate leaders, et cetera, they all believe, to continue with this one issue, that the United States should continue to fund and supply the Ukrainian side of the Russia-Ukraine war. This is a big change in the sense that the Democratic Party, from the failure in Vietnam, we'll just pick a year, not quite at random, 1968, through the end of the Cold War and beyond, was much more the peace party than the Republican Party. You could almost take for granted that on any issue of war and peace or national security or intervention, the majority of the Democratic Party, or at least very strong voices within the Democratic Party, would take an oppositional position. That's not really true anymore. The Democratic Party is overwhelmingly for these interventions, and especially for this intervention. So the only dissent that you hear about in this context in American politics right now is, as I said, from the Republican rank and file, from ordinary voters who are worried about how much money gets spent on a problem that they think is really none of America's business. And then from a few intellectuals, some of them, Democratic intellectuals or left-wing intellectuals. Now, like the Republican base, I will say, and I'm a Republican, and I'm part of the base, I suppose you'd say. Base in American politics means like the people who are just completely committed to you no matter what, that you can count on. The hard floor of your vote that's going to turn out and vote for you no matter what you do. So however big that is, right? The Republican base is not really super sophisticated about foreign policy. Like it hasn't, and I don't mean that as an insult, I'm just saying it like it is. It hasn't thought through some deep reason why it doesn't want to support the Ukrainian side of the war. It just sort of believes that it's expensive, the country's going broke, we have a lot of domestic problems. What does America first really mean if the United States is shoveling billions of dollars halfway around the world? And that doesn't make sense to them. It also follows, more or less follows what Trump wants to do, which is explain some of the unpredictability of the partisan dynamic in American foreign policy. That is to say, Trump can be, I'll make this point again a little later in greater detail, he can be surprisingly flexible on foreign policy. And his base will support whatever he says, even if a day before you thought that they were all going to come out for something else. The reason I think that's important is, for the foreseeable future, Donald Trump is absolutely the leader of the Republican Party and whatever conservative movement exists in the United States. And whatever he says will direct what those tens of millions, call it 80 million, maybe it's 100 million, probably not much more than that, but that's a lot of people, what they believe and what they say they want. And we don't know what the long-term implication of their outlook is going to be when, at some point, as one of my dinner companions last night said, perhaps insensitively but not inaccurately, actuarially, the Trump era has to end. I don't know if you know what the word actuarial means, right? It's a fancy word from the United States insurance industry, which just basically charts when people slip this mortal coil, to quote Shakespeare. Okay, so nobody lives forever. Trump can't be around forever. Just by definition, he can't be around forever. It wouldn't matter how old he were, it just can't. And when he's gone, whenever that comes, right, the Republican Party's foreign policy views, I think, are going to be up for grabs. And it's hard to predict what they're going to look like because we don't have a clear picture of it now because it's so driven by Trump's leadership. I don't know if you've noticed, so I'll make the situation that's been going on in Israel since October 7th has really roiled U.S. politics. You've probably seen news accounts of what's going on, these protests on campus, right? And if you lived in the United States and you turned on a cable news channel in the United States, I don't recommend doing that either, but some people love that stuff, including my wife, who leaves it on all day, and I come in and I turn the channel, and then she comes back and goes, "Why did you turn the channel?" It's like, 'cause I can't stand this anymore. I don't want to see this garbage. But anyway, it's also exposed a serious problem in the Democratic Party, and we don't know how that's going to play out in the Republican Party. That is to say, Democratic Party historically has been very strongly pro-Israel, but has had a sizable vocal minority of people who are very critical of Israel. And they've been prominent and dominant on campuses, but the critics haven't had much of an effect on the direction of the party as a whole. And this seems like the first time where their numbers are big enough and strong enough, in part, again, just for actuarial or demographic reasons, right? The older generation that one could count on to be reflexively supporter of Israel are aging out and dying off. The new younger generation that's coming up, trained on American campuses, is much less supportive, veering into outright hostile. And to some extent, this is a problem of the Democratic Party's own creation. That is to say, they have either never opposed radicalization of American college students on campus, or they've actively supported it. And they seem to have become stunned, surprised, and shocked to see these protests erupt since last fall, and ongoing right now. You notice that the protests kind of went away for a little while. I'm a veteran of campus protests, that is to say, not a participant in them, but an observer of them, because I've been around campuses a long time. There's another reason why West Coast campuses tend to be a little bit more active than East Coast, because there's no winter. And the weather's good in December, so why not pitch your tent on the quad and hang out, right? Well, you don't really do that where it snows. And so I went and visited Columbia University in February. There literally was snow on the ground, and it was peaceful and calm, and you could walk around the Lowe's Memorial Plaza, this big quad in the middle of the Columbia campus with the library behind you. You've probably seen pictures of it. It's beautiful, right? Everything was calm, no problem. Snow melts and the sun comes out. Hey, let's get out there and pitch some tents and raise hell, right? That's one of the reasons why you're seeing this happen in April, May. But it has shocked the Democratic Party. I think many of the leaders of the Democratic Party did not realize how completely radical the younger generation has become on this question, and they don't know what to do about it. And it's caused some other interesting dynamics. Like, for instance, one of the key states, the 2024 election is going to come down to at most 7 states. If you know how the U.S. Electoral College works, there's 50 states. Almost all of them, tiny exceptions in Maine and Nebraska, are winner-take-all. So if you win that state by 1 vote, you get all of its electoral votes. Now, there are attempts, mostly from the left, to gut and change that system and make the United States election system turn on the popular vote, but that hasn't been implemented yet and may never be. I hope it isn't, but who knows. Anyway, most U.S. states are so lopsidedly one way or the other that the outcome is not in doubt, right? There's no chance whatsoever that Donald Trump is going to win California, and there's no chance whatsoever that Joe Biden is going to win Texas. I mean, the Democrats, they're perennially hopeful that they're going to get Texas someday, and maybe they will, but it's not going to be this year. So there's 7 states where the vote is close, and the election will turn on those states. And one of them is Michigan. And Michigan has the largest Arab American population in the United States. And boy, do they hate Joe Biden's Israel policy. Now, the people who are Israel supporters, you almost feel a little sympathy for Joe Biden. Note I said almost. I don't actually feel any sympathy for Joe Biden. But if I were to feel sympathy for Joe Biden, it might be on these grounds. What can he do, right? His policy is not strong enough for the people in his party who support Israel. They think he's being weak. He's offering, at best, desultory and late rhetorical support. He hasn't offered the material support that the Israelis say they need, right? But then he's getting hammered from his left by college students, an important part of the base of the Democratic Party, college students and recent college grads, and by Arab Americans and Muslim Americans generally, in whom the largest concentration are all in Michigan. And he could lose that state in the fall. And if he does, this is one of the states that Trump won in 2016, on which the 2016 election turned. That would be a giant blow to Joe Biden's re-election prospects. And the weird part of this dynamic is if you're an Arab or a Muslim American angry at Joe Biden, you almost are certainly angry at him because you think he's too pro-Israel and he has tilted American policy too much toward Israel. And you're not going to go vote for Trump if that's your reasoning for disliking Joe Biden. So it's hard to see how the Republicans capitalize on that in the long term. That is to say, they'll obviously capitalize on it in the medium term if Trump wins Michigan. Now, on the situation in Ukraine, which is I think, much closer to home for a Hungarian audience. I would say for now, the United States is still completely, that is the people in charge, not everybody in the country, but the people in charge who make policy. So Biden administration, everybody who works there, and the leadership in the Senate of both parties, and apparently the leadership of the House, or at least the Speaker of the House. I don't know if you also saw this, but a kind of radical Trumpist member of Congress named Marjorie Taylor Greene, who doesn't have a senior leadership position, but she's very prominent in the party. It's sort of the way Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is always in the news, super famous. Everybody's always talking about her from the Democratic side, even though she doesn't have a senior House seat. She's not a senior member of the House and doesn't have a leadership position. Anyway, this woman from Georgia, Marjorie Taylor Greene, tried to introduce a motion to get rid of Mike Johnson, the same way that Matt Gaetz and some other congressmen got rid of Kevin McCarthy. And it was precisely over this Ukraine vote. It was a revolt saying, listen, we thought our party was for America first, not for funding foreign wars. And it just failed. I don't know if this was, the time change confuses me, so I'm not sure what time it is in Washington right now. It's like -6, right? So let's say it's middle of the night. People haven't woken up yet. So I guess this was yesterday. But the vote failed. She tried to kick him out precisely over this. And it failed. That's an example of how the uniparty works. And guess one of the people who rallied to Mike Johnson's defense, you might be surprised by this, was Donald Trump, right? So a lot of people were disappointed and shocked by that. They thought, wait a minute, isn't the America First, that's Donald Trump's big slogan, America First, isn't the America First position that we not give $69 billion, an additional, I should say, $69 billion to Ukraine? Well, here comes the America First presidential candidate saying, I support Mike Johnson. People don't know what to make of this. It's an example, though, of Trump's flexibility. There may be some potential reasons for that. Now, so as I say, the U.S. position is still to be committed to this effort, at least for a while. You can see signs of them getting weary of it, limits on what they're willing to do, but they're not willing to pull the plug or stop the support. Now, you ask yourself why, right? I don't know about you, but most of the people I know and read always think that they can find, maybe always is too strong, but they like to look for and find a definitive answer that shows that everybody making decisions or in a position of power has debated this question, whatever the question is, thoroughly, has come up with an answer, and there's always a tight rationale behind it. I don't actually believe that, right? Anyway, so what is the grand strategy behind this? Some say, well, now they know that Russia, Ukraine ultimately can't win the war, but the longer they keep it going, they're bleeding Russia, they're degrading its military capabilities. Maybe some believe Ukraine can win the war. Or maybe the possibility 3, this is the one I hold to, is nobody has thought this through. The people actually making policy in the United States, they're not really sure what the plan is or what the point is. I will guarantee you, because I've seen these documents in the past, I haven't seen the ones that pertain to the Ukraine war, there are pieces of paper in the interagency system in the United States government that state some kind of clear goal. And they may even say, our objective is a return to the 2014 borders, complete Ukrainian territorial integrity, and a Russian defeat. The paper may say that. Nobody takes that seriously, though, as a policy objective, because if they did, they would have to do a lot more than they are doing, and they would have to risk things that a lot more than they're willing to risk. In a way, this confusion and hypocrisy could be termed good things, because if the American Uniparty were entirely committed to all-out Ukrainian victory and a return to the 2014 borders and stuff, they would have to do things that would risk a war in Europe that could end up being devastating for not just Russia, Ukraine, but for many countries nearby, including this one, and potentially including my own, far away. And they won't do that, either out of prudence or, I was going to use an unkind word. Now I'm searching for another one. Either out of prudence or, caution. Now, if Trump wins, what will change? I think things will change. He will do something the Biden administration is not willing to do, which is try to open up negotiations in some way. And maybe this explains Trump's seeming about face on the question of aid, right? I haven't talked to the president in quite a while. So I'm speculating here, but knowing how his mind tends to work, I think it's not unreasonable to suppose that he looks at it and says, well, look, if I want to make a deal, why would I support taking the pressure off Russia now? I need that pressure for leverage. The less the United States does, the less there is an incentive for Putin to make a deal. And I do want to make a deal, but, I know from experience, this is me kind of channeling Trump, I know from experience that the way you make a deal is you got to keep your leverage intact over the person you're negotiating with or against if you want to get something out of them. And that may explain Trump's apparent about-face on the aid question and his support for Mike Johnson. He as I said, Marjorie Taylor Greene tried to get Mike Johnson removed, and Donald Trump came out with yet another statement, not just in support of the policy, but in support of Johnson personally. He's a good guy. We should stay with him for now. Note for now. He didn't say forever. But this is yet another sign of Trump's flexibility. He can surprise you. People think that they know what he's going to do in every circumstance, and he'll do something and he'll surprise you. The flexibility also causes some heartburn among his supporters who think that they know what he's going to do, and they think they know what he ought to do in every circumstance, and he doesn't always do what they think he ought to do, and they get mad. They never or rarely mad enough to abandon him. I think Trump is in part driven by two competing imperatives. That is to say, he wants the war to end, and he wants better relations with Russia on the one hand, on this side. On the other side of the ledger, he doesn't personally want to be seen as weak, and he doesn't want the United States to be seen as or be weak. And he's sensitive to accusations of collusion for obvious reasons, because he was accused of this he's still accused of it now, but this charge of colluding with Russia basically dominated the latter part of his campaign, all of his transition, and the first half of his presidency. And turns out, as he said all along, there was no collusion, but the American media is so powerful that if it wants to say that over and over and over and over again, as it did and does, that they can convince half the country to believe it no matter what the evidence shows. So those two competing imperatives, I think, pull him in different directions and may, to some extent, explain his flexibility. I guess before I get to this point, the question everybody wants to ask is he going to win? That's the only question I ever get. Is he going to win? I have no idea. I never predict elections. I feel more confident that he has a strong shot at winning today than I did a month ago or 4 months ago. The polling for him right now looks very, very good. He's ahead, depending on which polls you look at, he's ahead in 6 or 7 of those 7 swing states. Remember, the national popular vote, as our system works, still works for now, doesn't matter. Almost certainly the Democrats, whatever the electoral outcome, the Democrats will win the popular vote, as they have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections. Okay? They will win and by millions of votes. And in some cases, just turning on a handful of states. For instance, if you just take California alone, just that vote share of California out of the 2016 election, then Donald Trump won the popular vote in 2016. Right? That's how many votes there are in California for the Democrats. So whether he wins or not, I don't know. It's looking better than you'd think. There's still a lot of headwinds against him, including the ballot changes and rules that were implemented during COVID and never repealed and so on and so forth, that I think the Republican Party has fought and challenged ineffectually. So even with strong polling, a lot of headwinds. For instance, the United States, typically when an incumbent president or party is polling unpopularly, this is just simple democratic math, right? You expect the opposition to do better. Inflation was really, it's tamped down somewhat, but it was really bad in 2022. The Biden administration had absolutely abysmal ratings, and usually a new administration in its first midterm, so you're elected in 2020, the first midterm, which is only a congressional election and state level and local, comes 2 years later. Usually the party in power loses pretty badly. And 2022 looked like it was going to be a historic rout for the Democrats, and it wasn't. Republicans didn't do well at all. They got back the House, just barely, lost a number of winnable Senate seats. It just wasn't the crushing repudiation of the Biden administration, let's say Bill Clinton suffered in 1994. And so old school political science would tell you that with an incumbent this unpopular, his party is unpopular, all the ways pollsters measure public opinion in America. Is the country on the right track? Is it on the wrong track? How do you feel about the economy? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about America's standing in the world, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and so on? All of those numbers, you would look at them and think, well, clearly the challenger's going to win. And in any period of American politics up to about 2016, 2020, that would have been true. Things are now so different, I don't think anybody can make an easy prediction about that as far as it goes. And I certainly won't. Okay. The end game here, that is to say, a lot of what's driving American foreign policy right now turns on a person's interpretation of what other powers, in particular Russia and China, really want. And this is a substantive analytical disagreement that's hard to determine who is right, but this is what drives it, right? If, that is to say, ruling out unflattering explanations of people's low motives and just assuming people's high motives and then what they say aloud is really what they actually believe and what drives their policy, we may say that the disagreement comes down to the following. Do you believe, in the case of Russia, for instance, that Putin's objectives in Ukraine are just stage one to a broader campaign to rebuild, first the Russian empire of Catherine the Great, and then stage three would be the entire Soviet empire, all the way to Western Europe? A lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment absolutely believe that. They believe this is step one. He's going to go to Poland. He's going to go into the Baltics next. And then before long, you're looking at the Fulda Gap again as the central issue in European politics. It's just, 1950 all over again. A lot of people believe that. I had a debate about a month ago at the University of Texas, Austin, with a foreign policy intellectual, and that's in part the case he made. This is just step one, and then he's going to keep rolling, right? China, they definitely want Taiwan, and they're not going to stop at Taiwan. A lot of people in the American foreign policy establishment, both Democrats and Republicans, would say this. Taiwan is just step one, and who knows where it goes from there. The people who oppose this, in part, say they just don't believe that, right? They would say, well, maybe even if Putin had ambitions of that scale, his chances of realizing them are so low that he'd be crazy to try. He thought he would roll up Ukraine in a couple of months. It's now been more than 2 years. The death tolls are unbelievable. I don't believe any number that comes out of this theater of war, but if you just take the low estimates that each side gives for itself, right, the amount of casualties taken exceed by orders of magnitude what the United States suffered in Iraq and Afghanistan over 20 years. And what the United States suffered even in Vietnam over 10 years. And this has happened in 2 years over countries with smaller populations. In Ukraine's case, a much smaller population. So, as for China, the skeptics would say, look, there's 5,000 years of recorded history or if you just want to take imperial China as we know it, 2,000 years. And there's really no examples of China being an expansionist power beyond what it considers its immediate neighborhood, which, to be fair, is rather large. China's a large country, but there's no historical examples of a Chinese desire to global or world domination. And so these fears in the United States among the foreign policy establishment that Taiwan is the first step, and then who knows where they go next? Do they reconquer the Korean Peninsula? Do they try to go after Japan? Nobody actually quite spells this out, but it's worth asking, because if people say, no, this is just the beginning for them. Okay, well, what actually is next? There has to be a next if this is just the beginning for them, right? Nobody exactly wants to say, because I guess it sounds a little bit too fantastical. But that's the heart of the disagreement, is what do these powers actually want? And those currently in the driver's seat, 100% of the Biden administration and at least 75% of the Republican Party establishment would say that. This will be a big question mark if there is a second Trump administration, because in the first Trump administration, if those of you remember, lots of the people in the Trump administration who got senior positions of power held this view. Okay? And then there were a lot of people who didn't. And it seemed like the president himself was much more of the view that he wasn't super worried. I think it's safe to say President Trump believes that the great challenge from China is less territorial expansion than it is this economic war, this undeclared economic war that the United States and the West and the Anglosphere more broadly have been fighting and losing for the last 30 years. And that's where he wants to put his emphasis. Now, a second Trump administration, maybe I'll stop here and take a few questions. A second Trump administration will look significantly different than the first. And the president has promised this, he has said over and over, and I believe him when he says this, he says the biggest lesson he learned about his first administration was personnel. He just picked a lot of the wrong people and he trusted them for too long. And he's learned his lesson. He's learned how difficult it is to get this right, how he really needs people, who are loyal to the agenda, loyal to him personally. This always gets him in trouble, or it gets him in trouble, but it gets him criticized when he says, I need loyal people. And people say, oh, look at that dastardly Donald Trump saying that loyalty is going to be the first criteria. Like, instead of competence, I don't know how much you're familiar with American internet slang, but there's something in the internet in American slang we call the concern troll. And that's when the person says to you, like, let me tell you what it's in you. I'm worried about you. When your enemy or your opponent comes to you and says, I'm really worried about you. And let me tell you what I think you ought to do for your best interests. And the advice I'm about to give you is just do what's in my interests. Do what I want you to do, and it'll all turn out great for you. So there are all these concern trolls who say to Donald Trump, I'm really worried that if he gets in there, he shouldn't appoint loyalists. He should appoint just competent people, by which they mean people who agree with me and not him. People who want to do what I want to do and not what he wants them to do. That's concern trolling. There's a lot of that going on right now because Trump is saying, I'm not going to appoint people. Not to say he's going to appoint incompetent people. There are a lot of wonderful people he could appoint to various jobs who will do a good job, who will actually try to implement his agenda the way he sees it and formulates it. So if there is a second Trump administration, and if, as I believe is true, he has learned his lesson, as he has said, about all the mistakes he made in personnel the last time, then the next Trump administration is going to look a lot Trumpier than the first Trump administration. It's going to be a lot more aligned within itself, among the people who are appointed, and with the president's views, which is going to be one of the first real challenges that the uniparty establishment. 2016 and the first administration was a challenge, but the uniparty got a good 50%, maybe more, of cabinet and sub-cabinet appointments in that administration. It's not going to get that level of power again if Trump gets in there. And so I think you're going to see a real shift in American foreign policy with one big caveat, and then I'll stop on this note. That one caveat is Trump's flexibility, his ability to surprise you, his ability to do the thing that you didn't think he was going to do, that to some people is going to look like him taking the establishment position. And in some cases, that might even be true. In some cases, it won't be true. Okay. Questions? Are you going to pass the mic, or should I just call on people?
Thank you for your lecture, Mr. Anton. That was very interesting. I would like question that we are seeing a lot of territory of the United States is weakening, for example, the economic way of the situation of the dollars, for example. And if Mr. Trump can win the next election, what do you think? Can he rebuild the strengths of the United States, the credibility of the states? So this is our question. Thank you.
It's broad. I wouldn't mind knowing more about where you think U.S. credibility has, I have my own answer to that, where U.S. credibility has suffered and where it needs shoring up. I'll give you one example. Donald Trump wanted to get out of Afghanistan and didn't. I think if he had a second term, he would have gotten out of Afghanistan. And he would have done it in a neater, cleaner way than what actually happened. And I think the United States lost some credibility with just the ineffective, ineffectual, almost bungling manner of the Afghan withdrawal. Bungling in more than one way. We got 13 soldiers in one day. Actually, not all soldiers, some Marines, to be technical here, but and billions of dollars in equipment, shut down the air base before personnel were evacuated. That kind of thing harms American credibility, and I don't think that would have happened under a Trump administration, and I think those kinds of dumb mistakes are much less likely to happen because the president will be more on top of things. You know, and in other ways, I mean, you could argue that, well, American credibility is on the line because if we don't defend Ukraine, it'll drain American credibility somehow. A lot of people argue that. A lot of people in the Washington establishment say, you know, we have to defend Ukraine or we'll not be seen as a reliable ally. To which the counter-argument is, but they're not an ally, right? I mean, this policy was debated. Are we going to formally make Ukraine an ally or aren't we? And the answer, some people didn't like the answer, but the answer was no, we're not going to. So we're actually not obligated. So how is our credibility on the line for not defending a country to which we've not made a pledge, right? There will be, definitely, if Donald Trump tries to negotiate, opens negotiations over an end to the Ukraine war, he will absolutely, by his enemies and opponents, be accused of undermining American credibility. But a lot of that will be disingenuous concern trolling, not a real argument made in good faith. It'll just be in the political context of the United States, in which I don't know how clearly this gets across in Hungary or in Europe more broadly, but everybody in a position of power or influence in the United States, if it's not everybody, it's 99%, and it's more like 99.9999%. They really hate him. They really hate him. They think he's wrong about everything. He's a terrible person. They think he's stupid. They think he's evil. They think he has no redeeming qualities whatsoever, and he's never made a good point in his life. It's that one-sided. And so no matter what he does, he's going to be accused of, you know, just shredding our alliances and destroying our credibility, even if he does very sensible things that shore them up across the board. But the political discussion, the dialogue, the discourse, whatever, the United States is utterly poisoned and one-sided. This is why, as I said earlier, I really recommend just never turn on an American cable news channel. If you see one on, immediately change the channel or turn the TV off or break the TV, even better.
Thank you. My question is, if Trump can win this year, according to the second administration, what is the role of Europe and the EU countries in this emerging new order? Thank you.
Well, I think Trump will be every bit as hard on NATO members to meet the Wales commitment, the 2%, than he was before. And I think that will begin, you know, rhetorically, meaning he'll just lecture, jawbone you. And then I'm predicting, I'm speculating. I think then he'll start to make, you know, threats. That is to say, look, if you're not going to do what you said you were going to do, and I know Hungary is not in a bad position on. In fact, I just had to look this up fairly recently. You know, defense spending here is well in excess of the Wales pledge. So Hungary will not be on the naughty list. You know, this is a U.S. term for Christmas gifts. Santa Claus has a nice list and a naughty list. And if you're on the naughty list, then you don't get a present that year. Well, Hungary will not be on the naughty list. Neither will Poland, neither will Estonia, you know, but there will be a lot of other countries that are. And first they're going to get jawboned, they're going to hear lectures, they're going to get scolded, and then they may end up hearing, you know, threats about how seriously. I mean, Trump has already, you know, he was asked, I forgot how long ago, it wasn't that long ago, it was this year, should the United States defend a country that hasn't kept up its own defense obligations, even if they're in NATO? And he said, yeah, you know, no, I'm not sure we should do that. People went completely crazy. But from his perspective, you know, a pledge is a pledge, and a contract is a contract, and there's two sides to it. And one party to the contract is not obligated to meet its obligations if the other party isn't meeting its obligations, and he will see it that way. Now, if he tries to make a move, I think you will see the uniparty establishment rise up and try to stop him. And it was actually fairly effective at stopping a lot of things in the first Trump administration. And I can't predict how that would play out in a second. With regards to the EU, you know, that's much tougher for me to answer because I've just not heard him talk about it much. It never, like NATO was on his mind constantly in the first administration in the campaign. It will be on his mind constantly in the second administration. I don't really know much about what he thinks of the EU or if he regards the EU as of fundamental importance to the U.S. relationship with it. I mean, I think in general he can recognize the fact that political parties, political figures in Europe who are strongly pro-EU or pro-European integration tend to be aligned with the same sort of progressive ideology that dominates the Democratic Party in the United States, that is globalist in outlook. This is a term he doesn't like. That is to say, he doesn't mind the term, he doesn't like the concept that the term describes, right? He can see that, I think, pretty clearly, but what he would do about the EU as a matter of US policy, I don't know. This is not something that's been controversial in American politics for a long time. It probably should be more controversial than it is, but it's, the uniparty for 70 years. I mean, before there was an EU, before there was even a uniparty, there was a broad consensus among Americans, among Democrats and Republicans, that European integration is simply good for the United States, period. Well, let's not even think about it. And the people who have thought about it and raised questions as to maybe that isn't super true, they're only academics and intellectuals. Like, there are no, I'm not saying that there may be some politician somewhere, but like there's not even an anti-EU voice in the US Senate or a skeptic. That's not to say one might not emerge. I could imagine somebody like J.D. Vance coming up and saying, hey, I actually, has this really been good for us all these years? I don't know. I kind of doubt it now, but it just hasn't happened yet. It's just not become a thing. It's not become a driver of politics or even a kind of a question yet. Do you need a microphone, or you can yell? I can hear you. The audience won't be able to hear you.
Thank you. What is your opinion? What will happen if Trump doesn't win in U.S. regarding the war situation?
Yeah. Right. So the honest answer is I don't know. That I don't see the Biden administration as wanting to do negotiations. And even if they tried to change their mind and say, okay, we're ready to talk, I don't see the Russians wanting to talk to them. So that doesn't go anywhere. The real question is, how long and at what level are they going to keep up American aid to the Ukrainian side, right? Right now, it looks like on a duration question, the answer is forever. But as a matter of material support, the amount of money and equipment pledged, that's in kind of decline, right? They don't want to stop giving, but they want to give less and less. That's the position that they're in now. How long they maintain that outlook is hard to say. I mean, this question is so difficult to talk about in the United States because we don't have any sense of what's really going on there, I think. And if you try to just say, look, it's been 2 years and a lot of people got killed and a lot of things got blown up and like nothing is actually clear and no one's really accomplished much of anything, people just scream at you. They get really angry and they call you a Putin stooge. That's sort of the level of sophomoric discourse in America right now over the Ukraine question. And if and when the Biden administration, supposing it concludes that, look, we've spent, let's say he wins, we get to February 2025, 3-year mark of the war, and they look at it and they tally up all the money spent, all the aid provided, the death toll, and they just go, okay, a lot of stuff got blown up, a lot of people got killed, a lot of money got spent, and nobody anywhere is better off. Now it's time to start tapering this off. They've put themselves in a very difficult rhetorical position where Putin is Hitler reincarnated, where Russia is evil, Ukraine can do no wrong, and this is the moral standard of our, the moral question of our time, and Zelensky is Churchill, and there's no shades of gray, everything is good and evil, black and white, right and wrong, that it's going to be hard for them, even if they conclude on a sort of prudential level, maybe we should start tapering this down a little more, to get out of the rhetorical box they put themselves in. Now, that's not to say it can't happen. People change, politicians change their mind all the time, and then they get accused of being hypocrites. But you said you were going to do this, and now you're not doing it. You're just chickening out, right? That happens a lot. But every politician who changes his position on a thing like this knows going in that he's going to get that criticism, and they're sensitive to it, and they don't like it, so they're reluctant. And sometimes that means they just let things drag out. They delay the inevitable even longer because they want to put off the day and when they're going to get thumped by even their own allies for having said, for having reversed course. So, at least for a while, it'll look the way it looks now. At least for a while.
Thank you very much. My question would be, why do you care about Israel, the Israel war, and at the same time, why you don't care about Ukraine? To me, it's very puzzling because at the same time, it seems to me that you believe in the isolationist agenda, right? You believe fundamentally that the United States should not engage far away at the other side of the world. Or basically that's why you believe that you don't have any interest in Ukraine and you should be out of it immediately. So at the same time, why do you care about Israel? What's the difference?
You mean me personally or the United States? Because I obviously haven't said what I care about or not care about. I've tried to be entirely analytical here.
I'm actually interested in both.
I mean, so on the question of Israel, look, when the state of Israel was declared in 1948, this divided American politics instantly. It even divided the Truman administration. Truman's own Secretary of State, maybe the most prestigious man in America at the time, more prestigious than the president, George Marshall, opposed Truman's recognition of Israel and said he would first he threatened to resign. Truman talked him out of it, and he said, well, okay, Mr. President, but I'm not going to vote for you in this election. Imagine your Secretary of State saying, and it's an election year, it's 1948, I'm not going to vote for you, right? But the United States has felt a pretty deep commitment to Israel from the beginning, from its founding. And that has transcended political parties, and lately, and for the last 20 years, right, I would say as the Democrats have moved to the left, the Republican Party has become more the home of pro-Israel sentiment in the U.S. than the Democratic Party. The great exception being, certain old guard Senate leadership, old guard donors and political, but like on the youth trending against Israel in the U.S. and older generations and Republicans and conservatives, not trending pro, just have been pro for years. So, why does anybody care about anything? I mean, there are many historical reasons. It's just a fact, though, that the United States, and the United States cares about what's going on in Israel, and as you can see, it roils our domestic politics. But the extent to which we get involved, yes, the United States gives a lot of foreign aid to Israel, gives a lot of military aid to Israel, but if you look at the numbers comparatively on a year-to-year basis, or just it's dwarfed by what the United States has given to Ukraine. I mean, the last supplemental that just went through, the one that caused Mike Johnson almost to lose his speakership, was $69 billion. I think U.S. aid to Israel totals an average of $3 billion a year. I mean, that's a giant differential. So if you want to measure caring in terms of the amount of money and support put in, then the United States cares, whatever is 69 divided by 3. I do the quick math in my head. I think it's 23, right? 23 times more about Ukraine than about Israel. I think because of that kinship, because of that history, in part it's just domestic politics, right? I mean, every ethnic population in the United States, with certain exceptions, cares about what's going on in the country of their ancestry. Right? So Irish Americans have always been very involved in the troubles and the problems with England and the Catholic Protestant divide in Northern Ireland and so on. You could map that onto almost any ethnic community in the United States. Polish Americans in Chicago right now, really, really worried about Russia and Ukraine war and worried that the Russians will go after Poland at some point, and so on and so forth. So I don't, off the top of my head, I think the Jewish population of America is about 8 million, always have cared very deeply about Israel. That's one reason the country is going to care, is because there's a lot of citizens who have ancestry either directly or, and also the ties between the United States, American Jews, and Israel are a little different because there's a lot of people going back and forth. There's a lot of people who have family in the country. American Jews have blood relatives, close relatives who have gone back to live in the country and have served in the IDF, and so they really, really care. I mean, this is all kind of just human nature. And all of those ties, I'm only just giving you certain examples, that there really isn't that level of direct personal ties with Ukraine in the United States, and historically just hasn't been over the years. So that's just yet another reason, right? There's not a huge Ukrainian-American population. It's what there has been in the country for not as long as a Jewish population, and doesn't have that same level of very close ties that The Jewish population does. And Ukrainian politics have just never been a major concern of the United States in the same way. They never served, United States and Ukraine have never had an alliance the way the United States has with Israel, never cooperated on these kinds of military exercises and stuff. So there's just 10,000 reasons why, in general, American public opinion, to some extent of both parties, but as I said, nowadays concentrated in the Republican Party, though not absent from the Democratic Party, cares more about Israel than Ukraine. And so look, some of it is kind of just driven by the cable news cycle, right? American cable news was very, very interested in Ukraine war right when it started. They quickly figured out that nobody really knows what's going on. It's hard to know, hard to follow, hard to track. And also, look, some stuff is just driven by simple ratings. These guys are looking at ratings all day long. When we've got Kiev or wherever the front line of the Ukraine war is, people tune it out, and they turn off the TV or they change the channel. On the other hand, when we're talking about Gaza every day, and when we're talking about tent cities in Columbia University and pitched battles on the UCLA quad over this question, hey, everybody starts really watching, and our numbers go up, and our ad revenue goes up. It's good for business, and that drives it, too. I'm sorry that human nature works that way. I really am sorry that it works that way. I wish it didn't, but it does. Nobody knows how to change that. Okay? Well, I've been long out of time anyway, so thank you very much.